South Africa needs new cities as the current ones are old and overpopulated. These were the words of Human Settlements Minister Mmamoloko Kubayi, who says our municipalities and metros are taking a beating as many do not have clean audits. And in other cities, water treatment facilities have collapsed to the point that cholera is now claiming lives. Let's have this conversation with Professor Edgar Pieterse, who is the founding director of the African Center for Cities at UCT. Thank you so much for making time for us, Prof. So the population is growing. We have more and more people flocking to cities for opportunities as the economy also tightens. And these are cities that are old and overpopulated. Is the solution to build more cities as the minister proposes?
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Clement. And no, not at all. That is definitely going to add to the problem. The challenge we have is not to build new cities, but it is to use the existing resources we have and to do much, much, much better with the existing cities we have. So as a result of the legacy of apartheid, we've got a very poor spatial form in most of our cities, and that makes them unproductive. And it also means spatial inequality continues. So the real work that needs to be done is to densify our cities, is to create greater integration between the economy, where people live, and most importantly, across class groupings. And this is really the work that has been set out by the government in the Breaking New Ground policy already in 2004. And the tragedy of this search for a silver bullet solution like new cities is the fact that government has not been able to implement their own policies. And this is really where we are. So no, new cities is not the answer, because all it means is that you have additional expenditure, because obviously you have to deal with the citizens where they are and the needs that already exist in the existing cities. And what new cities do is they are speculative bubbles, and they attract investment and they detract investment from where the real challenges are of our cities. Yeah. So no, it is not a solution.
And another problem when we talk about the issue of cities is the lack of urban housing, which is another big issue for many South Africans who are far from economic opportunities. There's also that issue of affordability. Many people can't find decent or affordable places in the cities where they've migrated to, so they end up being relegated to the slums and informal settlements, and that comes with its own challenges of lack of services.
No, exactly, and so that is the big question. So there's two parts to this. The one is we need to do much better in upgrading the so-called slums or informal areas. And what we know from countries in Asia that have had similar problems, countries in Latin America that have dealt with the same issue over the last 40, 50 years, is that you have to invest in those areas and improve the quality of life and the public realm and the economic opportunities where those people are. Make it safe, make it clean, and over time those households then consolidate their footprint there, and especially if you bring economic opportunities closer. So that's one part of the solution. And government has acknowledged that, but again, they've not followed through with implementation for the last 10, 15 years. The other part of it is that you have to also create opportunities for young professionals and upper working class families in the existing suburbs. That means that you've got to get the private sector to put aside 20 to 30% of new residential developments in suburbs for lower income families and for young professionals, so that we can begin to get a better class mix in those parts of the cities where people are close to work opportunities. The third part of this is that along the transport corridors that we have where the public transport runs, when it's effective, that's where government needs to focus its own new rental housing opportunities. So if we can get those three things right at the same time in the existing cities, we can begin to provide affordable accommodation that's also livable and that can have an economic multiplier effect. Now, again, nothing that I say is new to government. They know all of these things. What we've seen, though, is a decided incapacity to implement their own policies over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah. And obviously there are some risks of people being, desperate to set up homes anyway, right? Some of the land that they occupy is not necessarily suitable for development, but that's the last thing on anyone's mind when they are desperate for housing. Do you think that the government has a proper plan to deal with this, though, Prof? Because the Minister of Human Settlements also a few months ago unveiled a global plan aimed at dealing with informal settlements and the slums. And one wonders how that's going to help in the long run, because the apartheid special development of cities, as you said, was characterized, by segregation. Unfortunately, it continues to weigh heavily on the development pattern of the country.
Yeah, so no, to answer your first part of your question, our government doesn't have a plan. I do know that they are working on putting together a white paper to basically set the legal and regulatory framework for a new plan. That's very internal to government, so we don't yet know the details of that. But my understanding is that something to that effect will see the light of day towards the end of the year. So I guess we've got to wait until then. But the mere fact that the minister can make a statement that we need new cities in an international forum tells me that no, they don't have a plan. They don't know what they're talking about, because that statement is against the existing policies that the government has and that the minister has a legal responsibility to oversee and to implement. Because to be clear, the government's existing policy is densification and achieving that, not to build new cities. The second part is that the minister's unveiling of this global plan, that was actually just a diplomatic effort where the South African government joined hands with United Nations Habitat, which is the agency at the UN level responsible for urban development and human settlements globally. And they've launched a global campaign to encourage governments everywhere in the world to pay more attention to the increased investment that's required to upgrade informal settlements to make them more livable. So just to be clear, no one wants people to live in slums. The problem is that if you look, for example, at our RDP housing, if you put an unemployed family into an RDP house, it adds a financial cost on them that they can't afford. They've got to pay municipal services, they've got to pay rates and so forth in certain parts of South Africa. So the fact that people live in informal settlements reflects the fact of our economic crisis, which is large-scale unemployment and a lack of household income. So you've got to be realistic about that. So the focus has got to be to take where people live. Obviously, if they live in completely environmentally unsound areas, as you've explained earlier, we've got to relocate them in a participatory way. But if there are informal settlements that can be consolidated and upgraded and made safe and livable, and we can bring economic opportunities there, we've got to work with those communities to achieve that. And that requires investment. And what we've seen from government is not that investment or the implementation mechanisms to achieve that. So I guess for now, we are waiting to see if they have a plan, but I'm not encouraged at the moment, because certainly if the minister is speaking against her own policies, I can't imagine that there's a plan somewhere in the background that is going to make a big impact.
Yeah, and speaking of economic opportunities, there are some people who are concerned that the increasing rates of migration will result in skills drain, especially for rural provinces like your Limpopo, the Eastern Cape, and other provinces. So it's going to be important then to create those economic opportunities in those areas so that the only option people have is not just to leave.
Absolutely. So I think, we've got to recognize that we need economic opportunities everywhere in the country, right? Rural areas, urban areas, peri-urban areas, we need economic opportunities everywhere. In the rural areas, the reason we've seen such a disastrous performance is because we've, again, not had a coherent and well-funded and systematic rural investment strategy in South Africa. So what we've seen is a consolidation of commercial farming. We've seen a disastrous land reform and land restitution program, which has actually left our poorest black households who got access to agricultural land with a deficit, because they weren't provided with the necessary agricultural extension support or the capital to become viable farmers and viable business people. So for poor black families, economic opportunities imploded. We did not diversify rural economies into tourism, into conservation, into, for example, restoration of soil so that it can become carbon sinks, which are the new green economic opportunities and so on. And so the issue here is that even though the ruling party talks about rural development as their number one manifesto priority in every single election, we just don't see the follow-through in terms of economic investment and a clear strategy to deal with the crisis in rural areas. So that has to be attended to, and we are going to see a continued migration to the provinces with the strongest economic performance for as long as that remains reality. However, it is not a bad thing to have migration, because when you have people in cities, it is actually cheaper to provide them access to water, services, sanitation, and energy, because you've got economies of scale, and the unit cost for extending infrastructure drops down. So from a development point of view, migration is not a bad thing. And in any case, our city regions have more resources than our rural municipalities. So it works for the country on aggregate. The last point to make is that we should not, migration is a red herring, because we are not seeing extreme levels of migration. This is all very natural. It happens in any middle-income economy, and it is good for the labor market. It is good for the economy that people move to where opportunities are. The issue is we don't have effective public policy responses, and we certainly don't have the implementation capacity on the government where the policies exist, and that's the underlying crisis.
What are the consequences of a government that's failing to implement its policies around this issue, Prof? Long-term consequences, that is, because urbanization is happening at such a fast rate, and if government is not equipped to respond urgently, or even have the appetite to respond urgently, there will be consequences.
Absolutely. So the consequences are already evident. So we've got extraordinarily high levels of social violence in the poorest communities in our countries, in our cities. Cape Town, for example, is the most violent capital, and all of that violence is concentrated in the poorest and in the working class areas. And that means that you are taking away from your human capital resource, which is the most important resource we have as a country, because the children who grow up there are unlikely to finish school and become productive members of the labor market. The second consequence is that we've got very weak economic performance, because what we now know from globalization and how the global economy works is that you need strong city regions that are competitive globally, that is going to grow the firms, grow the job opportunities, and drive the innovation you need in your economy in partnership with universities. But because our cities are they're functioning so poorly, it means that all of that potential, economic potential, is not realized. So we see GDP growth rates of 0.4%. What that actually means is that the city regions like in Gauteng, Cape Town, and so on, they've probably grown at about 2%. And the rest of the country is at negative growth. So we can push our city regions to grow at 6, 7, 8%, but again, we're losing out on that opportunity. And of course, it has an intergenerational effect, because it means you just have more and more people in the labor market that can't find work, that end up having to resort to other means to get an income, and it further frazzles the social fabric of our society. So we are already in a deep crisis, and that crisis is going to get worse if we don't see effective leadership in public policy.
All right, Professor Edgar Pieterse, thank you so much for making time for us. He's the founding director of the African Center for Cities at UCT.